Well, I'm Rob Matthews, and a bit of history as to why I'm here is my daughter was kidnapped and murdered in 2004. And the perpetrator, or one of the perpetrators of that crime, was arrested and sentenced to a life imprisonment. And I think naively, as a member of the public, one believes that a life imprisonment sentence means that that person's going to go away for life. But as you go through this journey, you are reintroduced to a whole lot of traumatic events again, because as a family, what we found is there's a system of parole that allows the perpetrator of the crime to come up for a parole hearing after 25 years. And I guess we got our heads around that 25 years we would come up and present our case as to whether we thought it was appropriate or not appropriate in terms of any rehabilitation that had taken place on the criminal side, and for us to be rehabilitated in terms of our trauma. So what I did was went through this journey, and in 2017 try to make sure that we had been registered as a victim, who there are rights that are given to victims, and you need to register that you have an interest in any parole hearing that comes up. The registering process sounds simple, but in fact it's not. And the problem that I have as a South African who sits in a privileged position, because I do have the technical resources and the ability to do online applications and chase and jump through hoops. There are so many people out there that don't have that ability, and yet that's where I would suspect the majority of victims of crime sit. And there's no mechanism that government provides in order for those people to register their interest in any future parole hearing. So that's why you hear so many cases and circumstances where all of a sudden murderers are now let out on parole. It's not because there's been a rehabilitation process. It's not because the victims have been part of a consultation. It's because nobody's bothered to get a hold of those victims to tell them what's about to happen, and then prepare them in terms of presenting their case as to why they think rehabilitation has not taken place with the perpetrator of the crime. I think it should be the other way around. You can put all the laws out there and all the regulations. And by the way, I try to find a concise summary of those regulations and requirements. And when I was doing that investigation, it doesn't exist. There are snippets of what you're entitled to as a victim of crime, and then all of a sudden there's another release, and then you find that version 2 and version 3 is available. There's no one place that you can go to where you can lodge your interest in any parole hearing. It should be the other way around, in my opinion. It should be given that any victim of crime has an interest in understanding or participating in a parole hearing. The default shouldn't be that if you don't come forward, then we're going to assume you're not interested. It can't work like that. That's the easy way out. And in fact, that helps, in my opinion, the justice system by checking their own homework, because they can then stand up and say, well, we've rehabilitated so many criminals and they're out again. And in fact, you're checking your own homework. There's no counterbalance. There's no independent body saying, well, have you really done these courses? What is the outcome of those courses in your rehabilitation process? Those are all part of a justice system that does that evaluation. And apparently that case file is then put together and goes to the parole board, and there are people that sit on that parole board that will do that evaluation. Now, if you as a victim of crime are not present at that parole board, that information may well be distorted, not intentionally, but just through mountains of work that has to get processed and go through and you end up with a criminal being released on the street, and in fact the truth is that that person should not be out yet. So in 2017, on the advice of the prosecutor who handled our case and who was brilliant, said we better make sure that we registered if we are going to want to participate in the parole hearing. So in 2017, I've jumped through a number of hoops. Here's the problem. Information is not up to date, because you would go to the website, find people that you think are part of it, send off emails, and the emails then bounce back, address unknown. And to me, that means that that person has either moved on and the website hasn't been updated, and there you sit again. So now you go through these hoops to try and find the right people to talk to. Eventually I found two people that were really very, very helpful, gave me information, who to contact, and then I jumped through a few more hoops to get to register that we were interested and wanted our position known, that as a victim of crime we wanted to be at a parole hearing that may take place. At that time I made an inquiry to say, when is Moodley's parole scheduled? And that was listed as 25 years from the time that he was convicted of the crime, and that would take place in 2030. Luckily for us, what we did is I started working on a portfolio of background information to try and understand what this meant. And through those workings, some 2 years later, I stumbled across an individual who I've engaged with to try and help us understand the whole situation. What can we expect? What happens at a parole hearing? What is the perpetrator of that crime? What is he involved in? What is he engaged in? How does he get to that point? And this person came back to me and said, do I know that his understanding is that Moodley comes up for parole a whole lot earlier than we were led to believe he would. Now here's a problem that I have. Why weren't we advised of that change in circumstances? We were told as to when his parole hearing was likely to take place. We'd registered our interest of being at that parole hearing, but nobody had the courtesy or thought to come back to us and say, by the way, these circumstances have changed. Moodley now comes up for a parole hearing a lot earlier than what was anticipated. Again, as victims of crime, we go back into this doom loop because we think, oh my word, we've got our heads around 2030, now we better start getting our heads around a whole lot earlier. I get that feeling that victims of crime are not that important in the process, because if they were important, somebody would have made an effort to get hold of us. Our address has not changed in 30 years. My cell phone has been the same number since cell phones were issued. We've gone nowhere. So there cannot be a claim to say that we tried and we couldn't get hold of anybody. Well, if you couldn't, try a lot harder. Get hold of those people that actually do need your support and do want to be part of that process. You can't take the easy option out. Sometimes I think that criminals have more rights than the good guys, and that just can't be right. We got this information that Moodley's hearing was likely to be a whole lot earlier than 25 years. By the time I got hold of somebody, again, more mails, people had moved on from the first lot that had confirmed the dates and information with me, more bounced emails because addresses were unknown, no updates. Eventually I got hold of somebody who, again, when I got hold of that person, incredibly helpful. So I have no complaints about the individuals that I eventually got to. I have a complaint about the process in getting to those individuals. They came back to me and gave me two sets of circumstances in terms of why this had changed. And I'm blown away. Why would that not have been of interest to me as an individual, as a family member that is interested in this parole hearing? I almost get the feeling that if we could have slid this out without getting people to get too involved in the parole hearing, it would have been a lot better because the circumstances would have been different. And here's the problem. When somebody comes up for a parole hearing, you can't be assessed by the criminal justice system. it's a little bit like the gamekeeper being the person in charge of the game. You can't check your own homework. You need some independent outsider that has the checks and balances and is able to bring a balance into that assessment. I haven't been through the parole hearing yet, but it sounds to me that that is one of the issues that is in place. There are a number of things in there that are just ludicrous. If you have a life sentence, then how can you have an earlier parole hearing if in fact somebody sat down and said, you need to serve 25 years, I would imagine that they've put some thought into that sentence. And I would think that some of the thought that goes into that sentence would be the nature of the crime, the severity of the crime, and how long would it take for the system to rehabilitate you. And if somebody's come up with a 25-year scenario, how on earth does it then end up being something like 16 years? You've dropped off 9 years out of the program. That is something that I just don't understand. And perhaps if there is validity in that adjustment, let us know about it. Let victims know about it. Why should we find that out almost by default that these things have taken place? Some of the questions that trouble me in this whole process is the format of the parole hearing, and I guess time will tell as to what that looks like, and I'll have a better view. The input of the experts, both from the perpetrator side and what rights I have in terms of bringing my experts. And I think the other part that really worries me is that the default option is, and I've seen it too many times, that going out on parole, you're still under sentence. Now, that really is a ridiculous statement, because once, from what I can see, a criminal leaves that institution, they are tantamount to being free. So there is, in theory, parole officers and a process that takes place. I'm not sure about that, because I have made some inquiries in terms of trying to find out how many vacancies are available for parole officers out there. And you would be surprised in terms of how many active parole officers that are delivering the high standards of what we as victims of crime would expect. So you watch TV movies and you see how the parole officer has a regular hearing. Anecdotally, from the interviews and discussions that I have had, that does not happen in South Africa. And I'd love to be shown or told differently, because then maybe I feel a whole lot better about the parole system. So in the absence of those backup infrastructure positions being in place, I would submit that parole is something that needs to be looked at very carefully. I think also the other part that worries me a lot when you go through this whole parole process and get into that stage, politicians, I think, take cheap shots at gender-based violence. And in fact, to me, it's all violence, but they seem to be focusing on gender-based violence. I think violence is violence. But if you focus down that area and make a statement that comes from the top of our government to say perpetrators of gender-based violence should not go on parole, well then let's see how that works its way through the legal system and through parole boards, because I think sometimes those statements are made throwaway for political gain, and in fact I'm not sure that the law even in fact supports those types of statements. So as a victim of crime, please give me that feedback. Please tell me what I can expect and what I can't expect. And what I don't want to be is disappointed by having one level of expectations and I go through the system and I find those expectations weren't grounded. I think it's the responsibility of the justice system and the politicians in South Africa to tell victims of crime what their expectations can realistically be. Please, politicians, don't cheapen the lives of the victims by your political statements that have no substance and cannot be substantiated and supported. If you make that statement, I would want to believe that it's grounded and that there's relevance in it. I think that as victims we deserve no less.
Die rede waarom ek betrokke by iets soos kan wees soos die paroolstelsel van ons land is dat in 2007 in die maand van Oktober het daar 'n tragedie in ons familie plaasgevind waar my vrou helder oordag in ons huis oorval is en ons huis vermoor is en blykbaar ook weer verkrag het. En dit het ons lewe op daai stadium totaal omgekeer. En van daar af het ek besluit dat ek wil deel wees van die stelsel waar die mense wat hierdie dade gepleeg het tot verantwoording geroep kan word. En ek is tans in die proses om nog met die nodige autoriteite in kontak te kom, maar ek het nog nie reeds met hulle gepraat nie, maar dit is die insident wat gelei het wat my betrokke maak by so 'n stelsel soos die paroolstelsel van ons land. As iemand met doodgaan as gevolg van 'n motorongeluk of siekte, en dan jy ook 'n verlies aan persone, en die impak is groot op alle families wat sulke verliese het. Maar as mense verlies het aan 'n persoon wat gewelddadig dood is, wat dood is op so 'n manier wat nie nodig was nie, het ek nou besef en die ondervinding dat die impak van dit is baie, baie meer as net iemand afstaan in die dood. Die impak is so dat jou familie se verhoudinge word daardeur geraak, jou familie se drome word daardeur geraak, dit wat jy wou doen verander totaal, my kinders se betrokkenheid in die gesinsverband het verander, my dogter het van dag 1 besluit, sy kan nie meer in daardie huis bly nie, sy het onttrek, my seun het 'n kort rukkie daarna vir 2 jaar werkspermit in Engeland gaan werk, en die einde van die saak vir my dogter byvoorbeeld het sy besluit, sy verlaat die land en sy bly tans in Kanada. Die hele saak het ek dopgehou, ek was elke dag in die hof gewees. Ek moes ook 'n bietjie getuig rakende sekere aspekte in die hof. So die beskuldiges op daai stadium het terdege geweet wie ek was, en hulle kon nie sê hulle het nie geweet wie ek is nie. Hulle het derentyd hulle saak probeer voer waar hulle sê hulle is onskuldig en dat hulle nie die misdaad gepleeg het nie. Hulle het nooit enigstens skuld erken nie. Hulle het nooit gesê jammer of so iets nie. En dit was vir my iets wat my baie geplaai het, iets wat my kwaad gemaak het op 'n stadium hier reg teen die einde van die verrigtinge van die hof waar die 2 persone straf gekry het hulle afbeweeg na dieselfde tonaliteit en hulle het reg voor by my wegbeweeg of na dieselfde, en ek het na hulle gekyk op 'n manier waar ek hulle laat weet het dat ek nie gelukkig is met wat hulle gedoen het nie. En die antwoord wat ek van hulle gekry het, is woorde wat ek nie hier kan herhaal nie. Was geensins enigiets om aan te dui dat hulle jammer was, of sê hulle skuldig is, of wil opmaak vir wat hulle gedoen het nie. Dit was totaal die teenoorgestelde. Op daardie stadium het ek baie beslis gevoel dat die wette in ons land ten gunste is van die misdadigers en nie ten gunste is van die wetsgehoorsame burgers wat ons land het nie, en was ek nie baie gelukkig met die regstelsel wat die vonnis hulle gekry het nie. Want aan die einde van die dag het ek uitgevind dat indien hulle lewenslank gevonnis is, wat albei wel is, plus verskeie ander vonnisse wat hulle opgelê is, beteken nog steeds daai vonnisse almal gelyktydig uitdien, en dat dit in effek dieselfde is as een lewenslange vonnis. En ek was glad nie daarmee gelukkig nie. Trouwens, ek is nou nog nie daarmee gelukkig nie. Ek wil beslis dan deel gewees het van enige paroolstelsel waar die mense dan aansoek doen om weer in die samelewing toegelaat te word sonder dat hulle enigstens erken hulle het skuld erken of enigstens gerehabiliteer is op so 'n manier waar hulle deel kan word van die samelewing. Ek wil deel wees van daai proses. Daar was ook iets vir my wat my krap, en dit krap my nog vandag. Daar was 'n derde persoon betrokke by die misdaad. Die mense weet presies wie hy is. Hulle het tot vandag, volgens my kennis, geen verdere inligting gegee oor hierdie mense nie. So as jy wil regtig iemand hê of wil gesien wees as iemand wat gerehabiliteer is, dan moet jy ten minste eerlik wees oor die misdaad wat jy gepleeg het en ten minste een ander regstelling probeer doen. Daar was geen kommunikasie van die departement van korrektiewe dienste, geensins nie. Ek het op hierdie stadium dit ook nie verwag nie. Maar ek sou graag wou geweet het wanneer is die moontlikheid vir parool vir mense met sulke vonnisse? Wanneer gaan hulle oorweeg word vir parool? Wanneer moet ek kan inset lewer of gaan hulle my vra om inset te lewer? Ek is nou betrokke by hierdie tipe van insidente in ons samelewing deur dit wat met my gebeur het en met my familie gebeur het. En uit die aard daarvan hou ek dit maar dop wat in die res van ons land gebeur en hoe sekere mense hanteer word en sekere sake hanteer word met die oog op parool vir die toekoms. En ek het waargeneem dat as jy 'n hoë politieke figuur is, dan sal die gesin of die persone wat betrokke is by daardie misdaad, hulle sal geken word in die parool aansoek of die paroolverwerking van die lid. Maar ek dink nie op hierdie stadium is volgens my waarneming is dit iets wat gebeur met die gemiddelde wetsgehoorsame burger in die land wat by hierdie sake betrokke is nie. En voel ek dat dit verkeerd is, want almal behoort dieselfde gesien te word onder die wet. Dit is nie net geskryf vir die wat politieke koneksies het nie. Ek glo nie daarin nie. En as ons 'n samelewing het wat goed funksioneer, dan moet ons daardie goed begin regstel.